Why is the world's most beautiful giraffe on the brink of extinction? At first glance, there is almost nothing about this animal that looks fragile. It stands nearly 18 feet above the African savanna. Its legs are longer than many people are tall. Its heart is powerful enough to push blood through a neck roughly 6 feet long. And its coat is covered with enormous dark patches, irregular and jagged like pieces of bark cut from an ancient tree. It is one of the most recognizable animals on Earth. And yet, for decades, its numbers fell. Around the same period that humans were dividing the savanna with farms, roads, fences, and settlements, one of Africa's most spectacular mammals was quietly disappearing from landscapes where it had once been common. The Masai giraffe was once considered the most numerous giraffe type in Africa. About 3.5 decades ago, estimates placed its population at roughly 71,000 animals. Today, the picture is very different. The latest state of giraffe assessment estimates roughly 43,000 Masai giraffe across Kenya and Tanzania, with a small reintroduced population in Rwanda. The numbers are no longer collapsing everywhere. In some places, they are stabilizing. In others, they are increasing. But that apparent recovery hides a much more complicated story. Because the real danger is not that the giraffe suddenly became unable to survive. It is that the world around it is changing faster than this giant can adapt. So why is one of Africa's most beautiful animals still considered threatened? And how did a giraffe that once dominated the East African landscape become a conservation emergency? The answer begins with something most people never notice. A giraffe is not simply a giraffe. For much of modern history, scientists treated giraffes as variations of a single species. But genetics, geography, and long-term field research have transformed that picture. Today, giraffes are recognized as 4 distinct species: Masai, northern, reticulated and southern giraffe. The Masai giraffe occupies a large portion of East Africa, particularly Tanzania and Kenya, with a small population in Rwanda created through conservation translocation. And it has a look that is difficult to confuse with its relatives. Its patches are large, dark brown and irregular. Their edges are jagged, often compared with the shape of vine leaves. Between them is a lighter background, creating a pattern that appears almost painted onto the animal. The pattern is not decoration. It is identity. No two giraffes have exactly the same coat pattern, which means researchers can use photographs to recognize individual animals without capturing or marking them. That simple fact has become one of the most important tools in modern giraffe conservation. A giraffe can now be photographed from a distance, its pattern analyzed, and its movements followed across years. The animal becomes a data point. Then another. Then another. And eventually, thousands of individual giraffes form a population map. Modern conservation is increasingly built around this kind of information. Giraffe Conservation Foundation's monitoring program uses photographs and identification technology to track wild giraffes, with tens of thousands of individuals now being monitored across Africa. But before scientists could track giraffes like this, they had to understand what they were looking at. And that turned out to be surprisingly difficult. The giraffe's body looks almost absurd. A head balanced on an enormous neck. Long legs that appear too thin to support such a huge animal. A tongue that can reach around 18 inches and is darkly pigmented. A heart weighing roughly 25 pounds. And a blood pressure system unlike anything most mammals have to deal with. The giraffe's greatest physical advantage is also one of its greatest physiological challenges. Its head can rise more than 8 feet above its heart. Every time it lowers its head to drink, gravity suddenly changes direction for the blood moving through its body. If a human tried to operate with the same geometry, the pressure changes could cause serious problems. But the giraffe has evolved an extraordinary cardiovascular system. Its heart generates very high blood pressure. The walls of its major arteries are thick. Valves help control blood flow. And specialized vessels near the brain help regulate the pressure of blood reaching the head. The animal does not simply tolerate its enormous neck. Its entire body has been engineered around it. Scientists have even studied the giraffe genome for clues to how such an unusual body evolved. Research comparing the giraffe with its closest living relative, the okapi, identified genetic changes associated with cardiovascular function, skeletal development and other traits linked to the giraffe's extraordinary morphology. The genome of the Masai giraffe has been part of this research. But the neck is only part of the story. The giraffe's height gives it access to food that many other herbivores cannot reach. When grass is dry and short, a giraffe can browse leaves high above the ground. Acacia and other woody plants become feeding stations. The giraffe moves slowly beneath the canopy, extending its neck, curling its upper lip around vegetation, and using a powerful tongue to pull leaves away from branches. It can reach food several feet above the heads of antelope, zebra, and other grazers. That gives the giraffe an ecological niche of its own. But it also creates a dangerous illusion. Because when you watch a giraffe feeding calmly above the savanna, it is easy to imagine that nothing can threaten it. That is not true. A giraffe can be attacked by lions. Young giraffes are particularly vulnerable. And adults can be injured or killed under certain circumstances. But predators are not the greatest threat to the species. The real enemy is much quieter. It does not roar. It does not chase. It does not have claws. It is fragmentation. Imagine the East African savanna several generations ago. A giraffe could move through enormous landscapes searching for food and water. Now imagine the same landscape divided into smaller pieces. A road cuts through one section. A settlement occupies another. A farm replaces woodland. A fence blocks a traditional route. Livestock occupy areas that once provided seasonal forage. Each individual change may appear small. Together, they can transform an ecosystem. This is one reason the story of the Masai giraffe cannot be reduced to a simple tale of poaching. Poaching matters. Bushmeat hunting matters. Illegal killing for traditional uses matters. Drought matters. But habitat loss and fragmentation are fundamental because they change the landscape on which every other part of the giraffe's life depends. In Kenya, increasing human population and expansion of agriculture and pastoral land use have contributed to habitat fragmentation. Prolonged droughts and poaching add additional pressure. In Tanzania, the same pattern appears in different forms. Human settlement expands. Agricultural land grows. Drought becomes increasingly important. And giraffes are forced to share landscapes with a rapidly growing human population. The result is not necessarily an immediate disappearance. It can be much more subtle. A population becomes divided. A migration route becomes blocked. A feeding area becomes inaccessible. A breeding population becomes smaller. And eventually, a species can begin losing ground without anyone seeing a dramatic moment when it happens. That is what makes the giraffe crisis so dangerous. There may be no single day when the forest disappears. No single night when the population collapses. Just thousands of small changes accumulating over decades. And the Masai giraffe has already experienced that process. The latest State of Giraffe 2025 assessment gives us a clearer picture. In Kenya, the assessment estimates about 14,179 Masai giraffe in 2025, with the population described as stable over the most recent 5-year period but still down substantially over 3 decades. In Tanzania, the estimate is about 28,820 animals, also described as stable over 5 years but approximately 27% lower than the 1995 estimate. Rwanda is the striking exception. There, the population has risen to roughly 163 animals after giraffes were introduced into Akagera National Park from Kenya. That population is small. But it tells us something extremely important. The story is not simply about disappearance. It is also about recovery. And that changes the central question. If giraffe populations can recover when protected, what is stopping the entire species from doing the same? The answer lies in scale. Akagera is a protected landscape. A population can be monitored. Its habitat can be managed. Human pressure can be controlled. But the Masai giraffe's wider range is enormous. It crosses national borders. It includes national parks. It includes community lands. It includes agricultural landscapes. It includes places where wildlife and people must coexist. Conservation therefore cannot simply build a fence around every giraffe. The giraffe has to survive in the real world. And that means understanding how it moves. This is where modern technology has transformed the field. In 2020, conservationists working with Tanzanian partners deployed GPS satellite units on giraffes as part of the Twiga Tracker initiative. Suddenly, researchers could watch the movement of individual animals over time. Where did they go? Which areas did they use during different seasons? Where did they cross roads? Which habitats were essential? Where were potential corridors between protected areas? The answers matter because protecting an animal is not always the same as protecting its territory. A park can be safe. But if a giraffe needs to leave that park to find food, water, or a mate, the landscape outside the park becomes part of its habitat too. Satellite tracking helps reveal those invisible connections. And there is another reason movement matters. The Masai giraffe is not simply walking randomly across Africa. Its movements respond to the environment. Rain changes vegetation. Vegetation changes food availability. Food changes movement. Drought changes all of it. And drought can turn an enormous landscape into a shrinking resource. A giraffe can survive in dry environments better than many people might expect. But survival does not mean immunity. During prolonged drought, food quality and availability decline. Water becomes more important. Livestock may compete for the same resources. People may move animals into areas that were previously used mainly by wildlife. And when the pressure continues for long enough, the boundaries between human survival and wildlife survival become increasingly difficult to separate. This is why conservationists increasingly work with local communities rather than treating them as an obstacle. The future of the Masai giraffe depends partly on whether people living alongside it can benefit from protecting it. Tourism can create economic value. Community conservation areas can preserve habitat. Education can reduce illegal killing. Rangers can improve protection. And scientific monitoring can identify where intervention is needed before a population reaches crisis levels. But even with all these tools, there is another threat that cannot simply be solved by protecting a park. Disease. The Masai giraffe has been affected by a condition known as giraffe skin disease, which produces lesions on the skin and has been documented in parts of East Africa. Scientists continue to investigate its causes, distribution, and consequences. That uncertainty matters. Because conservation is not only about knowing how many animals exist. It is about knowing why they are healthy or unhealthy. Why they reproduce. Why calves survive or die. Why one population grows while another declines. And sometimes the most important discovery is not a number. It is a pattern. A population may appear stable from the air while becoming increasingly isolated on the ground. A number may appear reassuring while genetic diversity is declining. A protected area may contain hundreds of giraffes while the landscape around it becomes unsuitable. The animal can still be visible. The species can still be in trouble. That distinction is crucial. It also explains why the Masai giraffe's conservation status has become a moving target. The IUCN assessment from 2018 classified the Masai giraffe as endangered, based on an estimated decline of about half over the preceding 3 decades. But improved population data have changed the picture. The 2025 State of Giraffe Assessment recommends that the Masai giraffe be downlisted from endangered to vulnerable under the relevant IUCN criteria. That does not mean the threat has disappeared. It means the evidence now suggests a different trajectory than earlier estimates indicated. The latest assessment describes populations in Kenya and Tanzania as stable in the most recent 5-year period, while Rwanda's small reintroduced population continues to increase. This is an important lesson about extinction. Conservation status is not a permanent label. It is a measurement of evidence. And evidence can improve. Sometimes the number of animals changes. Sometimes our ability to count them changes. Sometimes both happen at once. For decades, giraffe conservation suffered from a strange problem. Everyone knew giraffes were iconic. Almost nobody knew exactly how many there were. Reliable continental giraffe estimates only became available in the modern era, and improved surveys have substantially changed our understanding of giraffe populations. This is why today's estimates should not be compared mechanically with old estimates as though every number was produced using the same method. A population can appear to increase because animals were actually protected and reproduced. But it can also appear to increase because scientists finally found animals they had previously missed. The truth can contain both effects. And that is exactly what makes the latest Masai giraffe story so fascinating. The animal is threatened. But it is not necessarily doomed. In fact, there are places where the evidence is moving in the opposite direction. Look at Rwanda. In 1986, 6 Masai giraffes were moved from Kenya to Akagera National Park. 6 animals. That was the beginning. Today, the population is estimated at more than 160. That is not a recovery of an entire species. But it is proof of concept. Give giraffes suitable habitat. Protect that habitat. Monitor the population. Manage threats. And numbers can rise dramatically. There is something almost poetic about that story. The same animal that can disappear when its habitat is fragmented can return when a landscape is restored. The giraffe did not need to be redesigned. It did not need to evolve a new defense. It simply needed space. And that may be the most important fact in this entire story. The Masai giraffe's greatest vulnerability is not its height. It is dependence on a landscape large enough to support it. A giraffe is an animal built for distance. Its body evolved to travel, browse and survive across huge seasonal landscapes. But modern human development tends to move in the opposite direction. We divide. We fence. We build. We cultivate. We expand. The giraffe can survive many of these changes individually. The danger comes when all of them happen at once. And nowhere is that tension more visible than in the Masai Mara. The Mara is one of the most famous wildlife landscapes on Earth. Millions of people know its name. They have seen the photographs. Lions. Elephants. Wildebeest. Zebra. And giraffes standing against the horizon. But beneath the spectacular images is an ecological system under pressure. Research has documented severe ecological degradation in the greater Masai Mara ecosystem, including habitat fragmentation, fencing, changes in land tenure, competition with livestock, poaching and disease. A tourist may see an enormous grassland. A conservation scientist sees something more complicated. A network of habitats. Migration routes. Water sources. Breeding areas. Seasonal resources. Human settlements. Fences. Roads. And corridors connecting one protected area to another. The giraffe sees none of those categories. It simply moves towards the next source of food. That movement can carry it across an invisible boundary. One moment, it is inside protected habitat. The next, it is in community land. This is where coexistence becomes essential. A giraffe does not understand property lines. People do. And if conservation succeeds, both realities have to be respected. There is another misconception worth destroying. The idea that giraffes are harmless means they are defenseless. An adult giraffe is capable of delivering a devastating kick. Its long legs give it enormous reach. A single kick can injure or kill a predator. A mother giraffe can be extremely dangerous when defending a calf. But the giraffe's strongest defense is not aggression. It is size, vigilance, and the ability to see across the landscape. From several stories above the ground, the giraffe has an extraordinary visual advantage. It can scan over vegetation. It can detect movement at distances that would be difficult for smaller herbivores. And because giraffes often live in loose social groups rather than rigid herds, individuals can move and regroup without maintaining a constant formation. For a predator, that creates a very different problem from hunting zebra or wildebeest. There is no single mass to isolate. There are individual targets scattered through a landscape. But a calf is different. It is much smaller. It cannot run as effectively. And its height advantage has not yet arrived. This is why giraffe mothers face one of the most dangerous periods in the life of the species. The mother can be enormous. The calf is not. A newborn giraffe enters the world with a spectacular disadvantage. It drops several feet during birth because its mother is standing. Within hours, it must stand. Within days, it must move. The African savanna does not give it time to become comfortable. And this is where the giraffe's reproductive strategy becomes important. Giraffes invest heavily in individual offspring. A calf takes years to reach maturity. That means losing an adult female is not equivalent to losing one animal from a population. You may also lose future calves. You may lose decades of reproductive potential. This is why even apparently moderate adult mortality can have consequences that are invisible at first. The population may still look large. But its age structure may be changing. Fewer calves. Fewer breeding females. Older animals making up a larger proportion of the population. And eventually, the population becomes less resilient. This is why conservationists do not simply count heads. They examine populations. Age. Sex. Distribution. Movement. Births. Deaths. Threats. Genetic structure. The giraffe's future depends on all of them. And genetics has added another layer to the story. For years, the assumption that giraffes were essentially one species made conservation planning simpler. But it also hid important differences. Modern genetic research has shown that giraffe diversity is much more complex than the old classification suggested. The 4 recognized giraffe species are not interchangeable units. Protecting giraffes therefore means protecting specific populations and their genetic histories. A Masai giraffe is not simply a generic giraffe that can be replaced by another giraffe somewhere else. Evolution has produced distinct lineages. And once a lineage disappears from a landscape, restoring it may require deliberate conservation action. Rwanda demonstrates what that can look like. But translocation is not a magic solution. Moving giraffes requires planning. Animals must be captured safely, transported, released into suitable habitat, monitored afterwards, and the destination must be able to support them. If the original problem remains in the wider landscape, moving animals around can only solve part of the problem. The ultimate objective is not to create giraffes in protected islands. It is to maintain wild populations in functioning ecosystems. That is why habitat connectivity matters. A healthy landscape allows animals to move. Movement allows populations to interact. Interaction can reduce isolation. And connected habitats give animals options when conditions change. That last point may become increasingly important in a warming world. Climate change does not simply mean higher temperatures. It can alter rainfall, vegetation, water availability, fire regimes, drought frequency, and the timing of resources. For an animal that depends on browsing trees and shrubs across a seasonal landscape, these changes can have consequences. But climate is rarely acting alone. A drought becomes more dangerous when people and livestock are also competing for water. Habitat loss becomes more damaging when there is nowhere else for animals to move. A fragmented landscape becomes more vulnerable when extreme weather reduces the quality of remaining habitat. The threats multiply each other. This is why the Masai giraffe's decline cannot be blamed on a single villain. There is no one enemy standing at the edge of the savanna. There is a system. And the system is changing. Yet the Masai giraffe has survived enormous environmental pressures before. Its ancestors evolved through climatic changes. Its lineage survived predators, droughts, competition, disease, and dramatic changes in vegetation. What makes the modern crisis different is the speed and scale of human land use change. The giraffe has adapted to a changing Africa for millions of years. It has not had millions of years to adapt to roads, fencing, intensive agriculture, and rapidly expanding settlements. That is the central paradox. The animal itself is extraordinarily well adapted. Its environment is becoming less predictable. And perhaps the most surprising part of the story is that conservation has already shown that the decline can be reversed. The Masai giraffe is not a hopeless case. The latest population assessments are evidence of that. The 2025 State of Giraffe Assessment reports stable recent trends in Kenya and Tanzania, while the Rwanda population continues to grow. Giraffe Conservation Foundation also reports that recent conservation efforts and improved monitoring have produced a more optimistic outlook for the species than older assessments suggested. But optimism can become dangerous if it turns into complacency. A stable population is not the same as a secure population. And a population that has stopped falling is not necessarily a population that has recovered. The Masai giraffe still faces habitat loss and fragmentation. It still faces poaching. It still faces drought. And large parts of its range still contain important data gaps. The 2025 assessment specifically notes that Tanzania's estimates depend in part on data that are almost a decade old and that more targeted monitoring is needed. That means the next chapter of the giraffe story will be written partly by scientists. Not because scientists can save giraffes alone, but because you cannot protect what you cannot properly measure. A giraffe disappearing from a photograph may be sad. Hundreds of giraffes disappearing from a population database is a warning. Thousands disappearing from an ecosystem is a crisis. The difference is scale. And scale is exactly what conservation must learn to manage. Consider the enormous contrast between the giraffe's body and the threats it faces. This is an animal weighing well over 1,000 pounds. An animal that can tower above a 2-story building. An animal whose head can rise more than 15 feet into the air. And yet a relatively small fence can change where it moves. A patch of cultivated land can divide habitat. A road can alter movement. A period of drought can change an entire seasonal route. The biggest animal is not always the animal with the most control. Sometimes survival depends on the smallest details of the landscape. A corridor. A water source. A patch of woodland. A community decision. A ranger patrol. A satellite signal. A photograph. A child learning that the giraffe beside their village is worth more alive than dead. These are the real tools of giraffe conservation. Information. Protection. Cooperation. And time. Because time is what the giraffe needs. Its population cannot double overnight. Its habitat cannot be rebuilt in a week. And generations of genetic history cannot be recreated once lost. But if enough habitat remains, if enough adults survive, and if young giraffes continue entering the population, recovery becomes possible. The evidence from Rwanda demonstrates that 6 giraffes became more than 160. A population once absent from the country became established again. That is not a fairy tale. It is a documented conservation result. And there are other signs of resilience. The Masai giraffe remains widespread across Tanzania and central and southern Kenya. It is still present in major ecosystems. It still browses beneath the African sun. It still raises calves. It still crosses the same landscapes that inspired generations of photographs. The species has not vanished. Far from it. But that is precisely why the moment matters. Conservation is most powerful before extinction. After extinction, the options become painfully limited. Before extinction, there is still a population to protect. There are still mothers. Still calves. Still breeding males. Still genetic diversity. Still habitat. Still a chance. And perhaps that is why calling the Masai giraffe the world's most beautiful giraffe is more than a question of appearance. Beauty is subjective. Science does not measure it. But beauty can make people look. And sometimes looking is the first step towards protecting. The Masai giraffe does not know that humans consider its coat beautiful. It does not know that its species name appears in scientific papers. It does not know that conservationists are counting its spots. It does not know that satellites are following its movements. It simply walks. It feeds. It searches for water. It raises its young. And it moves through a landscape that we are rapidly transforming. That is the uncomfortable truth. The giraffe is not disappearing because it forgot how to survive. It is struggling because survival requires a functioning ecosystem. And ecosystems are not just collections of animals. They are relationships. Between trees and herbivores. Between predators and prey. Between rainfall and vegetation. Between protected areas and community land. Between people and wildlife. Break enough of those relationships and even an animal built like a biological marvel can begin to lose its future. But repair them, and something extraordinary can happen. The numbers can turn. The calves can return. the population can stabilize. The giraffe can move again. That is the real lesson hidden inside the Masai giraffe's decline. The story is not simply about extinction. It is about whether a species can remain wild in a world increasingly shaped by humans. And for now, the answer is still being written. On the plains of Kenya, a giraffe raises its head above the trees. In Tanzania, another walks across a landscape that has supported its ancestors for generations. In Rwanda, descendants of 6 transplanted giraffes continue to build a new population. None of them knows that scientists have changed the way we classify giraffes. None knows that its population has been measured, reassessed, and debated. None knows that conservationists are trying to predict where it will be able to live decades from now. The animal simply continues. And that may be the most powerful image of all. A species once thought to be in an irreversible decline is showing signs of resilience. But resilience is not invincibility. The latest evidence gives us reason for hope, not permission to stop. The Masai giraffe still needs space. It needs connected habitat. It needs protection. It needs communities that can live alongside it. And it needs the kind of conservation that looks beyond the boundary of a national park and asks a much bigger question. Can an entire landscape remain alive? Because if the answer is yes, the giraffe may have a future. If the answer is no, then even the most beautiful animal on the savanna can eventually become a memory. So perhaps the question was never really whether the Masai giraffe is beautiful. Perhaps the more important question is this. When we have the knowledge to prevent a species from disappearing, will we use it before the last great landscapes that sustain it are gone? And if you had to choose one thing to protect first for the Masai giraffe, its habitat, its migration corridors, or the communities living alongside it, which would you choose? Tell us in the comments. And if you want to see more stories about the remarkable species that are still fighting to survive in the wild, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.